Hello, everybody. I'm Scott Marble, the chair of the School of Architecture, and welcome everybody to our first event of the season of the semester. This is another first. This is our first fully online event. So we're looking forward to seeing how these work out. So bear with us if there's any glitches, but I think we've been doing this a lot. So I think we've been having a lot of meetings online. So I think we have this worked out. So I'm gonna I want to talk a little bit about some of the upcoming events, and then I'm going to hand it over to Ellen to talk in more detail about today's program. But just to mention a couple of upcoming events that we have planned. The next event scheduled is Craig Wilkins. Craig was invited by our Concave group, which is our PhD student organization. And Craig will be here on September 30th. And Craig is a lecturer at University of Michigan Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning. Again, that was on September 30th. And then on October 7th, we have Justin Garrett Moore that will be joining us for the first of a new lecture series that we have called the TSW, Lecture on Urban Design. Justin, among many other things, was a student of mine many years ago. But currently he's executive director of the New York City Public Design Commission. So we're looking forward to having Justin. And then we have another scheduled Redesigning Cities event on October 28th, titled Redesigning Cities and Suburbs for Women. And that features Eva Kale and Dolores Hayden. And we're still confirming dates for a few other lectures. We'll have the Portman Prize Critic Lecture this fall, and we'll have the Doug Allen Lecture. And we'll also have a student organization lecture, and those are in the final stages of being planned and scheduled, so look forward to that. So now for today's event, we're really pleased to be continuing the Redesigning Cities program sponsored by the Speedwell Foundation. This is, I think, the third year of these talks. And as many of you know who have been attending this program features leading urbanists that address urgent challenges to our cities today. And you'll hear more about that in a minute from Ellen. And also, before I introduce Ellen, I just want to, again, kind of give her a shout out. Ellen's done an amazing job of curating, organizing, and hosting these events. She not only hosts the events, but then they live on after the events through podcasts, which she and a group of students put together. And again, they've done a tremendous job over the last couple of years, and we're looking forward to this new season. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ellen to introduce today's speakers.
All right. And hi, everybody. Welcome. I am really delighted to be hosting the third season of Redesigning Cities. And I'm going to share my screen and just show a little bit of slides here. Welcome to episode 14 of Redesigning Cities, the Speedwell Foundation Talks at Georgia Tech. I am your host, Ellen Dunham-Jones, and I'm delighted to kick off season 3. And thanks again to the Speedwell Foundation. You can check out our previous episodes on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform or the webpage that is hosted within the School of Architecture's website. So these are some reminders of some of the past topics and folks who have joined us, and really do encourage you to check them out. They're really pretty great. Now, before we get started, we really welcome you. We want you to share your comments and your questions with us throughout this entire event. On the left side of your screen, you should see the Q&A button. Click that to post questions at any time through the event. And if you like someone else's question, please hit the little like button to let me know that that topic is particularly popular. We also welcome you to make comments throughout, but for that, please use the event chat button. We will not be monitoring the chat for Q&A. Now, with your screens open and this being online, we also welcome you to follow, tweet, post screenshots to Twitter and Instagram. Now, before we dive into episode 14, I do want to give a little bit more of a plug to episode 15. As Scott said, October 28th, we will be discussing redesigning cities and suburbs for women. And I'm thrilled to bring us Dolores Hayden, recently retired from Yale, and really the historian of feminist architecture and of what might be considered the anti-feminist ways that suburbia constructed women's identity. Now, we're pairing her with Ava Kale, who has been working on gender mainstreaming for the city of Vienna, Austria, for a couple of decades. And she has really been responsible for rethinking the equitable accommodation of women in public space. Julie Kim and I will guide the conversation and the Q&A. And please note, we will be starting 1 hour earlier to accommodate the time difference in Vienna. Now, finally, this afternoon is episode 14, Redesigning Cities with the Green New Deal. We're co-hosting this event with Places Journal, an incredible free online resource that's really essential reading devoted to public scholarship on the future of architecture, landscape, and urbanism. Georgia Tech is very proud to be a longtime academic partner of Places. And the editor of Places is Nancy Levinson, who is joining us tonight. Nancy is both the editor and a frequent contributor on the importance of design, the public intellectual, and the erosion of so many aspects of anything public. And as an architect, she has spent most of her career helping architects and other designers find their voice. I can say personally, we became friends because she is such a fantastic, but also somewhat vicious, fantastically vicious editor. And she's done that at Places, at Harvard Design Magazine, the Phoenix Urban Research Lab that she was director of, and at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. Now, Billy is the director of the McHarg Center and on the faculty at the University of Pennsylvania. Previously, he worked in the Obama White House Domestic Policy Council as a community organizer, planner, and landscape designer. He's a prolific author. I encourage you to really quickly skim all the titles that he has and is currently working on, primarily focusing on issues of climate change and design, the Green New Deal, and the relationship, or lack thereof, between design and public policy. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and really, at this point, just pass it on to Billy.
Thanks so much, Ellen. I just want to begin by thanking you and everyone else at Georgia Tech for inviting me and for allowing Nancy and I and you to have this conversation, which in some ways I think kind of began almost a year ago or so in Fayetteville, Arkansas at the last Places board meeting on campus at the University of Arkansas, which is my alma mater. And we began a conversation sort of about climate change and design and the Green New Deal there. And so really excited to be able to continue it with you today. And I'm gonna zip through some slides for us just to kind of help tee up the conversation, and then I'll turn it over to Nancy. The one thing I will say quickly is if you hear scuttling around in the background, my dog is here and she has the zoomies, so she is just like parkouring off of furniture like in front of and behind me. So don't be alarmed if you hear a crash. It is just her like running into something. So I'm going to talk about the Green New Deal, kind of what it is in its current formulation, why it's appearing in that formulation, why it looks and sort of acts the way it does now. I'm going to look really quickly back at its central reference, the New Deal, to get a sense of sort of why it became the central reference for Green New Dealers and what lessons we might be able to pull out of it as we think about what a 21st century version of that might look like. And then I'm going to point really quickly to some work that I've led in the center over the last couple of years now that's beginning to ask some of these questions about where do the design professions and disciplines fit within the kind of restructuring and reorganization of society that Green New Dealers are calling for. And so sort of fundamentally, it's always important to begin with, I think anyway, like what the Green New Deal is. And of course, it's many things. It lives in many places. This is, I'm pulling here from HR 109, the non-binding resolution introduced in February 2019 by President Cortez in the House and Senator Markey in the Senate. But it also, lived in various formulations in the 2020 Democratic presidential primary, continues to live in a whole bunch of other documents that we'll talk about, I'm sure, throughout this afternoon's discussion. But if you look just at HR 109 itself, that sort of introductory document, amongst the many other sort of non-spatial things that it calls for, it also puts forward a very ambitious built environment agenda, one that is, in some ways, parts of it are at the core of the way design thinks about space and place now, and much of it is at least within our core skill set. And so just to go through these quickly, these are, I'm pulling here lines directly from the resolution. It calls for building resiliency against climate disasters, repairing and upgrading all U.S. infrastructure, achieving a zero emission energy standard across the entire economy, building an energy efficient and distributed smart grid, retrofitting every existing building in the country for maximum water and energy efficiency, realigning all federal industrial policy around clean manufacturing, lowering ag-driven GHG emissions, overhauling the entire U.S. transportation system, investing in public lands and other things that have been called either low-tech or natural carbon sequestration, and then remediating every single hazmat or brownfield site in the U.S. So, like nothing, no big deal, something we could easily do in 10 years, just kind of check that box. I think any one of these would be amongst the most ambitious sort of design ideas put forward at a national scale in quite some time, and together they're probably the most ambitious one we've ever seen, and certainly in the last 100 years. And HR 109 it gets through a lot of this material really quickly. It's about 14 pages. This is most of it here. And just really quickly to understand it, it tells us a lot in the actual prose used to construct the resolution about sort of where the authors, where the movement leaders who are putting it on the table for us are coming from in the way that they're thinking about climate action at the national scale. And so just really quickly, these are things that are obvious probably to some of us, but are relatively novel on the floor of the U.S. Congress. So the opening paragraph directly references the IPCC's 1.5 degree report and assessment report 4, posits that human activity is the dominant cause of global climate change, and positions the U.S. as primarily responsible for the impacts of global climate change, which, again, not news to anyone, probably in any school of architecture or design around the U.S. or around the world, but is quite amazing to imagine being introduced in a resolution on the floor of Congress just a year and a half ago. It connects the climate crisis to a variety of other overlapping crises, not the least of which is the crisis of inequality and injustice. And then it points us towards the World War II mobilization and New Deal as imperfect examples of what's needed, the scale, scope, and pace of what's needed to respond adequately to climate change. And then the last and probably most important is that it's truly unique amongst American climate plans in its ability to fuse the more technocratic concerns about carbon sequestration mitigation with the demands of blue-collar workers and labor unions, or the jobs and economy piece of this, alongside the demands of frontline communities, which tend to form the sort of carbon, jobs, and justice planks or pillars that hold the G&D together as a sort of formal political strategy or program. And this obviously stands in pretty stark contrast to just the most recent version of a national climate plan that we had back in 2009 and 10, Weitzman Markey, which focused exclusively on that technocratic piece, the emissions reduction piece. And its most optimistic projections, if implemented, were that it would lead us to about a little over 4 degrees Celsius of warming across the planet. So a little over, near about 2.5 times what the IPCC has recommended as sort of a critical threshold of 1.5 degrees. And unsurprisingly, because of these shortcomings, it actually fought in Congress, certainly by the right, but also by the environmental justice and climate justice movement, in part because it didn't really pay any attention to either job creation or redistribution of wealth. And for most of for the movement groups who put the Green New Deal on the table, that was a non-starter for them. It's a similar fight we've seen play out at the state level in California, where those movements actually were crushed, and California's version of this was passed into law. But we can talk about that a little bit more in discussion. And this is also in contrast to some of the alternatives that have been developed in response to a Green New Deal. This is former Energy Secretary Ernest Moniz, putting forward what he called a Green Real Deal, which unsurprisingly, again, focused almost exclusively on science and technology and innovation policy, so how to develop and commercialize and deploy clean energy technology in the landscape. Intentionally positioned in his sort of telling of this plan, the Green Real Deal as against the inefficiencies of the GND, which he basically explicitly calls the justice and frontline communities piece of the GND inefficient and unrealistic. And it's not particularly surprising given Secretary Moniz was primarily responsible for lifting the crude oil ban in 2015 or pushing Congress to do that, and was also one of the key authors of the all of the above energy strategy that sort of dominated at least the first term and a half or so of the Obama administration's energy policy. And so thinking about these kind of formal plans as being the sorts of ideas that the Green New Deal is in conversation with and perhaps pushing against, there are also non-public plans for what might happen in the event of the kinds of climate crises that folks out west, I'm sure, Nancy, I can't imagine what it looks like outside your window right now, but folks out west and across the rest of the U.S. have been living through for quite some time. And I'm speaking here a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but also actually quite seriously that the plan for many of America's elite and the world's elite is to simply bug out when things get bad. They've been buying up land in New Zealand and other parts of the world where they can build underground luxury bunkers, where they can be accompanied on their trip by paramilitary forces like Pinkerton to ensure that they get there safely. And I meant this a little tongue in cheek, but actually this is already happening now. So back in March and April, as certainly the U.S. and most of the West began to sort of close their borders as COVID-19 sort of raged across the U.S. and most of the rest of Europe, those who could get out and had bunkers or fallout shelters or just luxury accommodations in other countries to get to went to them, often accompanied again by these private security forces or paramilitary forces. And I think this is in many ways this has been a sort of test run for how bad things can get. And what might come of the kinds of crises that climate change left unaddressed will bring to us in the coming years. And the last thing I'll say about sort of this why question, why the Green New Deal looks the way it looks now, is in part a response to Reed Hunt and others' analysis of the last time we had a sort of major stimulus program in the U.S. And I'm talking now of the 2009 American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. This is sort of colloquially known as the Obama stimulus plan. And Reed was a senior advisor in the White House at the time, was as inside on those conversations really as anyone could be, and produced probably the most critical assessment of, say, the first 2 years of the Obama administration of anyone who's put out a book in the last 10 years. And amongst the many sort of findings he sort of foregrounds in that book, he points towards ARA, the stimulus package, as failing for three big reasons. One being it was way too small, $831 billion, sort of negotiated down from about $1 trillion. And as we've seen, I think in the last 6 months or so, the amount of money that's been put forward in direct spending in response to COVID-19, it's pretty clear that the arguments that people wouldn't accept a stimulus package of $1 trillion or more were just nonsensical at the time. But nevertheless, that was the argument that ruled the day. That stimulus package was far too targeted to Wall Street and big business, and it represented a one-time funding sort of mechanism. So there were no recurring funds. And this is where I think, Nancy's work, especially has been really, really insightful, way ahead of its time and prescient, I think, in thinking about, sort of how and why something like a Green New Deal might emerge. And Nancy's writing here in 2010, for Places Journal, that it's as the Obama stimulus is being passed and now implemented, it seems increasingly clear that the Great Recession is not sparking a new Deal. We confront our crisis in a political climate that's contemptuous to the very idea of the public. And, thinking then about what we mean when we say a new Deal or a Green New Deal requires us to look back at the New Deal critically, which I can't do in just a couple of minutes, but we're going to sort of begin to pull on those threads, and Nancy and I will sort of pick them up as we go. I always like to use this slide to begin that conversation, if only because a couple of these posters are quite iconic as a part of the federal arts program or project that was part of the New Deal, but also because one of my students last semester found this dinosaur syphilis poster, and I just can't stop using it. I can't stop running out of excuses to use it, so you're welcome for that one. But Nancy, she's written this elsewhere, but also at last year's event that we hosted in Philadelphia called Designing a Green New Deal, I also think put put this really succinctly and well. It's a thing we should sort of hold in our minds as we think about what a Green New Deal might be or mean. And she said the New Deal is best understood not as an overarching plan, but as a series of improvisations held together not by theory, but by strategy. And I don't know that I would agree on the theory part, although we can talk about that, but she's absolutely correct that the New Deal itself wasn't a sort of checklist that FDR and his advisors were running through over the course of the 1930s. Instead, it was a series of sort of ad hoc legislative efforts, executive actions, and a variety of other sort of regulatory actions that ultimately added up to what he sort of initially pitched as the New Deal during his first campaign. And again, we associate the New Deal with all kinds of things that aren't spatial, like Social Security. But also the New Deal, in addition to producing those are really our only universal program and some of our other sort of key components of the social welfare state in the US, also produced about 55,000 built projects all across the United States. And you're looking here at about 16,000 or so of them. Richard Walker and his colleagues out in California have this incredible site called the Living New Deal, which is documenting all of these projects. And, you know, in preparing to come join you all today virtually, I'm always curious about what impact the New Deal had on college campuses. My alma mater, the University of Arkansas, you can point to about 16 buildings, including actually the football stadium, which were all built with either PWA or WPA money. But those of you who know Georgia Tech's campus far better than I do, this is probably not a surprise. There's a huge cluster. I think Ellen told me before we started there were about 12 buildings funded by various New Deal alphabet agencies. You can see the cluster of them here. There were a few more sort of in Atlanta and in suburban Atlanta you could point to as well. But I think when designers think about the New Deal, they tend to default to thinking about the TVA. And they do that for lots of understandable reasons, chief among them being it was run by architects and landscape architects. And so it becomes this sort of mythical story within design about what's possible when architects and landscape architects are sort of given the keys to power. And I think also because it's quite beautiful and intentionally so. The TVA was really one of the first forays in the American experience into creating infrastructure that was more than unifunctional. So in addition to generating hydroelectric power, the TVA was intended to be a spectacle. And its dams, and this is the Norris Dam here in Tennessee, became some of the most visited public sites in the US over the course of the 1940s and 50s. I believe in the 1947, which is kind of considered the first peak year for tourism again in the post-war period, the TVA system becomes the second most visited public set of land in the US behind only the National Mall. And you know, within it, there's all kinds of really interesting messaging. Again, very obvious here, thinking about the kind of aesthetic attention given to each of these facilities by designers that have attracted designers to this model for a very long time of really centralized, semi-autocratic planning in the Tennessee Valley of the Southeast. But those conversations tend to stop at the aesthetic considerations of the TVA. They don't really get into the political economy that made it possible. And so I'm pulling here from Brent Siebel, who's a colleague in history here at Penn and has written widely about this era and the TVA especially, that despite Black residents constituting over 7% of the population around the Norris Dam, they made up just under 2% of the workers who qualified for TVA jobs. Electrification promised significant improvements in standards of living for some rural Americans, but the pernicious inequities of Jim Crow were left largely untouched. And we'll talk about this, I'm sure, in our conversation, but this is the partnership model of the New Deal that presented so many lingering problems and ultimately led to the collapse of the New Deal coalition politically, was that it relied on existing power structures for implementation. And Reinhold Martin has a great piece called Abolish Oil, also in Places Journal, that I'm sure Nancy will talk about in our conversation, which begins to point at some of the physical manifestations of this compromise with Jim Crow, most notably here in the construction of literal segregated facilities like water fountains and bathrooms. And Reinhold, points here in that piece saying that the regionalism that governed the TVA reconfigured state power around hydropower. And in doing so, it helped to naturalize segregationist folkways that preserved racist social systems. And I say that because within the public power conversation, which is so key to the Green New Deal, the TVA has become the sort of the chief precedent that's cited by opponents of public power for why public ownership of utilities won't work. And they do that because it has one of the dirtiest energy mixes in the country. It relies really heavily on coal, which has really nothing to do with its ownership model and everything to do with the political economy of the Southeast, where it sits, but nevertheless has become a really prominent punching bag. And it's not like we don't have other places we could look. I'm not going to talk in a ton of detail about them, but the Rural Electrification Administration is an obvious one. The REA, you're looking here at the physical footprint of it across the U.S., builds about 380,000 miles of transmission line throughout the U.S. It stimulates or protects or constructs 800 or so rural electric co-ops that are still in operation today. That 380,000 mile number is about 42% of all the lines ever built in the history of the U.S. built by the REA. You have the precursor to the FAA, the CAA, which builds really important municipal airports like Midway at the time, but also again just invests during that 10-year period about $1 trillion in adjusted dollars into the airport infrastructure of the U.S. And these weird lines you see connecting some of them are just the pre-radar navigation systems that they were asked to construct, which literally just included putting arrows on the ground that you could look out the window for navigation purposes. And then the more familiar examples, again, the Civilian Conservation Corps. And I don't put these in here we can talk about the details of them in this conversation if we want to, but really, again, just to demonstrate the sort of scale, scope, and pace of what was made possible by this massive infusion of a well-funded activist public sector in American life during this period. And while people, I think, often remember the New Deal, and probably appropriately so, as a sort of soft jobs guarantee for blue-collar workers, mostly young men with pickaxes and shovels out there with the CCC, it also functioned in a sense as a sort of white-collar jobs guarantee. You're looking here at the landscape architecture profession only, but their footprint within the New Deal's various alphabet agencies. And this is coming from Phoebe Cutler's work in her great book, Public Landscapes of the New Deal. And so to begin to kind of wrap up the New Deal piece and then to take us to our conversation, this is again pulling on this is Brent and colleagues now, wonderful book, Shaped by the State. They have a really cutting analysis of, I think, why the New Deal's model of partnership was so fraught. And so the pragmatic political utility of local administrative autonomy and public-private partnerships were an essential part of the New Deal. The American federal structure simultaneously presented a tool and a barrier. It made possible the New Deal's most ambitious programs, and it enabled some of the most progressive parts of the New Deal to persist at the state and local level once the winds of national politics had changed. But beneath the cheery language of partisanship often lay a bitter truth. The prerogatives of localism and partnership built into the New Deal embedded new forms of racial and gender inequalities. And we've looked at a few of those, and I won't spend a ton of time talking about the work we've begun to do in the McHarg Center because I'm getting pretty close to time here. But just to say that it's all sort of motivated by, I think, this question that's in a piece that I developed with Nancy and Josh Wallert and her colleagues at Places last year, called Designing the Green New Deal, that's asking, can a set of practices tied to luxury real estate deliver anything meaningful to communities impacted by global warming and inequality? Or put another way, can designers be both an instrument of neoliberalism or capitalism and an activist force in the fight for climate justice? And I think the answer to us is quite obviously no, but then what do we do with that kind of analysis? And again, I won't spend a ton of time on these, and actually I will begin to wrap this up here and won't do the rest of the slides. But I'll just say quickly about these kind of 4 squares you see on here, and we can pull up more slides later if we really want to. One of those has been focused on sort of public tool building. So in the top left there, you can see a project called An Atlas for the Green New Deal. There are other versions of this that are now in development within the center. And the idea there was to take the sort of scattershot of critical climate and built environment data that's either paywalled behind various sort of journal or academic URLs across the internet, or just to take the scattershot of public data in either of those fields that's available now and collect it in one place into something that was compelling and curated and beautiful, that would be available to anyone with connection to the internet, who wanted to sort of get a sense of both historically, contemporaneously, and into the future what kind of impacts climate change is expected to bring to where they live. And there's 100 some odd maps there and 30,000 some odd words of text I could take you through. In the top right there is the first in what's now a 2-year sequence of studios I've been running through the McHarg Center called Designing a Green New Deal. And it began last year by sort of asking our students 2 critical questions that resulted in some work that we can talk about in the conversation. But the 2 questions were, what are the parts of the U.S. that from a technical perspective you have to get right to achieve those jobs, justice, and decarbonization goals of the Green New Deal? And then from that limited universe of places, what are the regions you would put first in line for that investment side of a Green New Deal, either because they are places of historic disinvestment, or because they offer an opportunity to grow your political coalition and to have enough runway to realize something like a Green New Deal across the entire U.S. And ultimately, they settled on 3 really compelling regions: Appalachia, the Mississippi Delta, and the Midwest. And we can talk about those again if we want to. And then in the bottom left, you can see some of the more sort of policy-focused work we've done. I know I'm talking to a bunch of architects, so you might have seen this already last year, but this is related to a bill we helped write for Representative Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Sanders called a Green New Deal for Public Housing. There's a bunch of supporting research that Daniel Adana Cohen, Julian Brave Noisecat, and a whole bunch of others sort of helped us put together on that front last year. And then in the bottom right has just been some programming we've tried to do, putting some of these sort of national movement org leaders who've been putting the Green New Deal on the table as a sort of package of ideas that constitute a national climate plan, in conversation with planners and designers, so that we can begin to think about what these sort of implementation questions might foreground for us now that need to be figured out before something like this is actually realized. And so with that, I'm going to ask, while I'm vamping for a second, Nancy to begin sharing her screen, or not sharing her screen, turning her video on, because I'm really looking forward to our conversation here. And we'll turn it over to you, Nancy.
Thank you, Billy. And I want to thank Ellen for the invitation to participate in this conversation that has been going on, I think, even longer ago than November, at least since we were working together on your article. You've laid out a great set of challenges. Specifically, how can the design disciplines participate in the transformative agenda of a Green New Deal? And even more than that, I think you're interested in the possibility that the design disciplines might play a leadership role in its implementation. So clearly, this is a goal or set of goals that goes well beyond the practices of ecological design, of sustainability or resilience thinking. And in your Places article, which you referenced and which I encourage everyone to read, you call for nothing less than remaking the discipline of landscape architecture, and by extension architecture, as, quote, something more than a client-driven enterprise. And you just put on the screen a really good question. Can a practice tied to luxury real estate and urban development deliver anything meaningful to communities impacted by global warming? So with all of that out there, here's another question, or a cluster of questions. Are you seeing signs that this kind of shift is starting to happen? Because it would involve a really profound reorientation for both academia and practice. So are you seeing signs? And if so, what are the pressure points, again, in practice and academia, that might yield to these new urgencies? And conversely, what do you see as the chief obstacles?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think the short answer is yes, of course, there are signs that I think this kind of shift is happening. I think we can see them in many different places. One of those is just, I think, in the rise of attention or popularity of the architecture lobby, which is, I know you're a board member of, I just became a board member of, and is sort of fundamentally organized around this question of design professions and their relationship to capital and client-based or fee-based services. And you can also see it for anyone who spends time in a school of design or a school of architecture now, whether it's, everywhere that I've gone to have conversations like this, whether it's at Penn, whether it's at Harvard, whether it's back at the University of Arkansas, whether it's Iowa State, Nebraska, all the places I've kind of crisscrossed over the last year, these conversations are omnipresent amongst students. And I think this is kind of where, I think before I had to jet out to fly back to Philly when we were having this conversation in Fayetteville, this is kind of where that conversation ended, is that schools of design, the schools of design who are doing best on this topic are the ones who are listening the most and sharing the most power with their students, because students are way ahead of most faculty and certainly most administrators, I think, on this question of where we fit into, either a decade or a century defined by these overlapping crises, of which climate change is one of many. And I think when we think about the barriers, again, they are very real, and they are, some of them are easy to imagine, sort of navigating. Some of them are much harder to imagine. And chief among them has been the drift over, I would say, sort of the last 20 years or so away from critical theory and away from confrontations with capitalism and away from sort of questions about this private and or public client-driven, like wealthy municipality-driven form of practice, even when it's focused on public sites, what we might call the public realm. And this sort of winnowing of the design professions from a more expansive set, at least theoretically, of ideas into ones that are not only simply reproducing the same kind of sort of luxury real estate and redevelopment projects that have always been part of the design professions, but are now able to sort of operate free from criticism in most circles. And some of the folks who sort of led that post-critical turn in architecture, in landscape architecture, in city planning, now preside over some of the institutions that we very much need to transform. And I think what the challenge that's in front of us now is whether or not those design schools are going to be transformable in the time period that we need. And if so, I think we don't have a great theory of change for how to get there. And if not, I also don't know that we have a great theory of change for what to do in the event that those institutions aren't going to necessarily be a big or core part of this say decade or multiple decades defined by the Green New Deal. And I think often of the book, A Planet to Win, that my colleague here, Dana Aldana Cohen, and our friends Thierry Francos, Alyssa Battistoni, and Kate Aronoff wrote last year, in which, you know, the book is essentially like a socialist manifesto for the built environment in the Green New Deal. But they open the book in the first few pages by saying something along the lines of, you know, ultimately capitalism and planetary or sort of responding to climate change are incongruous. They're not reconcilable, but they can't imagine transforming capitalism in the next 20 years in the time period that's needed to sort of address some of the questions or issues that are foregrounded by the Green New Deal. And so I think, you know, with that kind of sort of framework in mind, I think the challenge before us now is thinking through what we do in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years within the academy and beyond to sort of build some path dependence in. So if you think about a lot of the infrastructure, public works making, built environment making that design and designers do, what are the parts of that system that we can plug into that lock in lower emissions, more just outcomes, and a different kind of economy? And those are really hard questions to wrestle with. But I think that's kind of that's often where I go when I sort of think about this question you raised.
Well, I would say there's another set of questions there as well, because if you look at the reference for the Green New Deal is the New Deal, and you know Franklin Roosevelt famously transformed the government of the United States, but he also said that he was doing it to save capitalism, and a lot of people thought he saved capitalism from its worst excesses. And in many ways, he did something similar to what was done, in England and Europe after the Second World War. Basically to modulate the cruelties of capitalism with a very, very strong welfare state. And what we are seeing right now is over the past 40 years is the dismantling of that state. But
Absolutely.
I think, yeah. So in a way, it feels to me like one of the bigger challenges in the Green New Deal is for us to reimagine a public that has the kind of resources that the New Deal brought to bear. And, I want to just raise something that I found in your Super Studio brief. And just for listeners, so the McHarg Center, among other organizations, has put out this fantastic project. It's the Super Studio to design Green New Deal projects. And if I understand you right, you want these projects to be available, potentially for implementation, should a Green New Deal, when the Green New Deal happens. So there was one part in the frequently asked questions where you said, how realistic do our ideas have to be? And you fudged it a little bit by saying, well, they could be really innovative or they could be realistic, you decide. But then you said, the question was, the FAQ, do we have to cost our projects in some other way to prove they are viable? And you said, if it's important, yes, but it's not mandatory. And where I'm going with this is that one of the things that we might think about, again, are some of the underlying structures that made a New Deal and made the post-war expansion of the New Deal possible, which, just not to get too wonky and nerdy about this, was our tax system. And in your article, in your Great Places article, Design and the Green New Deal, you talked about the idea of an expanded pedagogy in the design disciplines. Thinking about the kinds of courses that would prepare someone for taking a leadership role in government, which was not only working on projects, but thinking about systems and, thinking about the organizations like the WPA, like the CCC, like the Public Works Administration, that commissioned, these tens of thousands of projects. So I guess I want to push on this question about what we need to do, and you're at a school, what we need to do in schools. So, I wonder, wouldn't it be interesting if designers who are studying the New Deal had to figure out, not only look at the bill legacy, but look, dive down under it and say, well, how was that paid for? How did we pay for the interstates? How do we pay for all the infrastructures of water and power? Wouldn't that be illuminating?
Yeah, no, this is such a great question and point. And I guess I should preface all the Super Studio stuff by saying, I love all of my colleagues I'm doing that with, but also there was, inevitably having a large team means I can't get everything that I want into the Super Studio brief. And so I think when we think about kind of where landscape architecture and city planning all kind of sit now, it's certainly not true across the entirety of the fields, but for the most part, they are very bound or constrained by a real sort of capitalist realism sense of what is possible. And by that, I mean, it's very hard to imagine work coming out of a school of design or out of a firm that isn't very tightly tied to some of these sort of economic structures you're sort of pointing us towards. And when you do see bits of more speculative work that are kind of divorced from the political economy, they tend to be a little more frivolous or playful and less, I think, engaged with the kinds of transformations of the political economy that would be necessary for that kind of a system to be created. And so, setting aside the New Deal brief for just a second, or the Green New Deal Super Studio brief for just a second, this is always a piece of what I try to bring into the studios that I run, is that we, for a 16-week studio, we might only spend about 7 weeks actually drawing or designing anything. The rest of that time is spent in really close reading and discussion of critical text. And in this case, for the Green New Deal, that's about understanding not just the physical footprint of what the New Deal made possible, but the social and economic and political economic systems that predated it, existed in parallel with it, and then continued for a time after it. This is where folks like Raj Patel, Brent Siebel, Lily Geismeyer, others have been really, really important, I think, to the work we've tried to do there. And I think ultimately, I was sort of mentioning in that first round of questions, this sort of post-critical turn in design is really a big piece of that is turning away from analysis that's connected to political economy. And I don't expect every designer coming out of design school to sort of share the same kind of political analysis with me. But I do think that understanding of systems and of structure that kind of critical theory offers were some of the best preparation I had for going into the public sector. So understanding both like the way that cost benefit analyses legitimate certain kinds of projects over others, the kind of ideology that produces cost benefit analysis as a measure that we think works for whatever reason anyway, and then thinking creatively about ways to sort of change those systems of evaluation. Because ultimately, I think when you think about the breakdown of where designers go within the field, into private practice or into sort of public service, and although I'm critical, obviously, of private practice in that piece and in most of the other things that I do, that's never going to go away. It's always going to be a core part of what designers do, and that's fine. But I think the way that we ought to think about those two sort of general tracks are that the private sector is where you go to do sort of high-profile, individualistic kinds of work, and the public sector is where you go to have impact. And not that you can't have impact in the private sector doing work on, say, a huge municipal park system or whatever it might be, but when you think about how to instrumentalize the kinds of ideas that often underpin or frame the most progressive, the most advanced, the most exciting one-off design projects around the world, the sort of public sector and the political system is really the only place where there's an opportunity to take those kinds of ideas to scale. And for all of its flaws, and the New Deal had many, that's the piece that is the most important, is thinking about the political compromises that made it possible, and also the sort of material investment in people in place that allowed FDR, and then after FDR, sort of Democrats across the United States, to have a coalition of people who were committed enough to at least a broad set of ideas, again, many of which were imperfect, that gave them another 30 or so years or 20 or so years to continue pushing a variety variations of the ideas that underpinned the New Deal into public policy throughout, the 1940s, 50s, and 60s.
So let's assume that when the Green New Deal happens, there will be parallel efforts to rewrite the tax code, and the public coffers will be just bursting. So that raises another question, and about the character of the Green New Deal. So as noted, this would involve a profound realignment of our politics and culture. A move away from valorizing private enterprise to thinking in terms of public good. But there's another paradigm shift that's happening now that speaks more directly to the design disciplines, and that has to do with the difference between our 21st century world and the world of the New Deal, which began almost 90 years ago. So as you know, designers, just love to look at all of the projects that were created by the New Deal, the tens of thousands of built projects, and you showed that map that the Living New Deal has crowdsourced. I think it's worth noting here that the New Deal was happening in a country, again, starting in the 30s, that was much less built out. This was the United States before the interstates, before commercial air travel, before the big dams in the Southwest that allowed the Sun Belt to happen. And, Ellen knows this, before the rise of suburbia. In contrast, one can argue that the Green New Deal will need to focus much less on building new public works and much more on fixing or retrofitting old ones, including the legacies of the New Deal. So I've been reading a really great essay, Rethinking Repair, by the media scholar Steve Jackson, and he starts by setting up a big contrast between a 19th century world of, as he says, progress and advance, open frontiers and endless development, and our 21st century world, which he says is characterized by growth and decay, fragmentation, disillusion, and breakdown. And he argues that we need to practice what he calls broken world thinking. So, are the design professions ready for that? Are we ready to embrace a Green New Deal that's much more about fixing a broken world than building a new one? Or as Shannon Mattern put it in an article for Places, are we ready to shove aside the paradigms of innovation and newness and replace them with ones of maintenance and care?
Yeah, this is
a really big shift.
Yeah, it would. The short answer again is that design is nowhere near that point. We have in many ways sort of adopted the same rhetoric you would expect to find in Silicon Valley. It would not be hard probably to do a quick transcription check between, say, someone like Elizabeth Holmes and pick your sort of big name in design world right now and find a shocking amount of overlap, or maybe not shocking. But I think this question is really important for lots of reasons. One is that, you raised this point earlier, but I think it's relevant here too about, FDR's move through the New Deal to sort of save capitalism from itself. And so even there in his version of what, say, sort of public capitalism could do or sort of state managed economies could do, his first impulse wasn't to rely on the public sector to fix things. So the REA is sort of the default agency that I always point to when we think about what democratic implementation of some of these large scale investments might look like. But the REA's first year of existence, it had no mandate and no funding. Its job was to facilitate the private sector's construction of utility lines, transmission lines from the urban centers that they serve to the rural parts of the country where electrification rates were about 10%. And after about a year or so of sort of haggling with the private utility companies who refused to come back to FDR with a plan that he thought was reasonable, in year two, he just said to hell with all of them and funded the REA at something like 100 billion or so in equivalent dollars per year to begin building this out. And unlike their European counterparts at the time, which were focused really on trying to decommodify a bunch of these public goods, the REA is one of the only examples of that kind of process really happening in the New Deal. And the rest of the New Deal, which we really tend to find, is this public-private partnership model or federal and state or local government partnership model, where goods weren't necessarily decommodified, they were just, more tightly controlled. And one of the things that, in addition to this question about sort of care or retrofit or repair versus, say, the construction of new infrastructure, is also just about what kinds of power we want to either challenge or create with these kinds of investments. And there are lots of ways to think about different ownership models that produce different kinds of small d democracy or democratic values in places than the sort of typical PPP-led model of construction. But to come back to the sort of retrofit repair model, I think this is where we've done a little bit of work and where the most exciting work is kind of happening. And I think, my colleague here, Daniel Aldana Cohen, has written about this before. He has a great piece in Jacobin called The Last Stimulus, which I think is from 2016 or 2017. It feels like, a million years ago now, even though it's only 3 or 4. But where he really writes that, whatever investment comes through something like the Green New Deal has to be the kind of last major infrastructure investment. And from then on, it becomes a sort of model of maintenance, repair, and care. And I think even he, just a few years after writing that, would argue that even that's probably not right. I think for some pieces of infrastructure, in particular, a sort of distributed smart grid, there is a lot of new construction that has to happen in the electricity and energy sector. But for the rest of the built environment, which is most of the rest of the US, when you look at public housing or housing generally, when you look at public schools, when you look at public land, public infrastructure, public works, we've overbuilt most of them. The interstate system was finished in its construction 35, 40 years ago, and yet we continue to build and extend it. And every single lane mile of highway we build locks in new carbon emissions. Every single lane mile we build requires exorbitant amounts of carbon to produce. And I say locks in carbon through VMTs and other kinds of induced demand travel. And so what we've really tried to do here is to say, okay, we have this massive collection of elements of the built environment in schools, housing, public works, sort of you name it, that all have massive deferred maintenance problems because we haven't had a culture of care or a sort of political economy of care in any of these things. The model is to build them and forget them. And so when you look just at, say, public housing alone, where we have somewhere between 1.2 and 1.3 million units in the United States that are actual sort of in perpetuity units of public housing, we have something like $120 billion or so deferred maintenance deficit in them. This is by HUD's own measurement. And that's just to take care of things like getting asbestos and lead out of them, to provide enough ventilation and HVAC for that they're actually habitable 12 months out of the year and safe to use if you want to turn your oven on. But to go in and take care of that entire deferred maintenance budget, it's like 120 billion. And if you add something like 40 to 60 billion to that total cost, you also get them as close to net zero as is technologically feasible, like at the moment. So for what's basically a rounding error in the grand scheme of things, for whether it's HUD, the Treasury, or another source of funds, that's one of the most obvious cases to be made for sort of coupling these investments in say, justice and jobs with decarbonization. And the last thing I will say, because I think I could talk forever about this, is just that the arguments for this are actually they're really compelling, even if we don't focus on public housing, although I think that's where we should begin. It's why AOC and Sanders sort of began there, because they think it's sort of the first key strategic lever in this path towards building something like a Green New Deal. But I think even beyond that, the sort of landscape of what's necessary to fund or what's necessary to do on the maintenance and repair and retrofit side, it's just a really obvious jobs case. You get something like between 12 and 18% more jobs per dollar spent on maintenance, repair, and retrofit than you do on new construction, whether it's greenfield or highway expansion, whatever it might be. And thinking about who the sort of necessary partners are to sort of pull together the kind of coalition that would make something like a Green New Deal possible. The building and trades unions, which are basically the people who build all the things that architects and landscape architects design, or much of it anyway, that's the most salient argument to make for them, is that, and this is always the case when you're talking about the kind of managed decline or sort of restructuring of a state or national economy, is what happens to all of the people in these industries that are being sort of managed to nothing. This is a common sort of conversation or tension point in the fossil fuel industry, and particularly in the building and trades unions too, is, if we move away from this sort of endless feeding of money into the real estate development complex that wants roads and houses and greenfield development, what happens to all of our jobs? And the answer is pretty obviously that there are a lot more jobs in maintenance and repair if only we would put the money aside for them.
Oh, I definitely agree there. And you've just given an amazing answer, that just provides so much of the detail. And I would say, speaking as an editor, that we also need to create whole new narratives around this so that maintenance and repair don't have to compete, with newness and innovation, so that they're, in a sense that they're just as exciting, because the projects actually can be. And on this, it's interesting to think that one of the things that the New Deal did really well was creating a narrative around what it was doing, whether it was all of those posters or the WPA writing project and music project and the project of presenting to the public what they were doing was really compelling. And it feels to me like that needs to be a strong part of a Green New Deal. And it feels to me like it needs to be a strong part of enlisting the design professions, in this and sort of creating, I agree with you, it's not a question of either or. It's a question of just creating a parallel ethos of public service and the opportunities, that will attract great design students in that, and great design practitioners.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would add to that, because I think you asked this question earlier, and I think I skipped over it a little bit, is just thinking about, there are two things. One of them relates to how private design firms kind of spend their burned billable hours time on competitions and other things that aren't guaranteed to ever pay off. The other is around the kinds of projects that the Super Studio is really intending to sort of stimulate. And I think on the firm side, again, design firms they commit labor all of the time, not well-paid labor, but they commit labor all of the time to entering almost endless amounts of design competitions to build whatever the next Highline or next sort of like splashy luxury real estate, development project might be. And it's understandable why. Those are high-profile things that if one can lead to all kinds of other things that their business development officers care a lot about. But one of the things we've been talking to principals and firms about doing, although I don't know that any have actually done this yet, is using that time instead to actually build relationships with some of the movements in their community who have, very radical and very, relatively concrete visions of the future for themselves, and do not have the sort of visual, tools or language that designers can offer to sort of help take those things from either, megaphones or, written word documents into sort of visions that can attract the kind of funding that would make them possible. And I'm thinking in particular, say, of the PES refinery site here in Philadelphia, where Philly Thrive, which is one of our local EJ groups, who all live around the refinery. And this refinery, I should mention this because if you don't live in Philly, you probably don't remember. This is a refinery that exploded like a year and a half or so ago and took out a chunk of the neighborhood, was running well past its sort of design life and had been sort of listed as probably going to fail in some catastrophic way about a year or so before it did. This has been one of the things that some of our colleagues here in the school, and I'm thinking of Ellen Nice's and Praxis in particular, have been talking with them about doing, is how to spend time we would burn on work that doesn't pay much for the firm anyway, on building relationships and providing some kind of design services to movement groups who already have pretty concrete visions for the future, but don't necessarily have the same tool set to put some of those ideas in competition with the more conventional downtown redevelopment work that typically attracts that money. And for the Super Studio, I think it's imagined in some of the same ways. And obviously, again, there are lots of things I could imagine having folded into that project that don't make it in when it's that large of a group. But I think the idea is that, thinking back to 2009 and the Obama stimulus, the really only sort of measure of whether or not a project was eligible for funding was whether or not it was shovel ready. Didn't matter if it was a project anyone wanted, if it was a project that performed any kind of real interesting benefits for its community, just had to be ready to build so we could put people to work. Not an unreasonable thing to imagine at the time when we had something like 13% unemployment. But I think the idea for us in the Super Studio is to get the sort of conceptual work done and get some of the sort of aligning of interested parties outside of the typical growth machine that runs the sort of political economy of most of these places around the country together through this Super Studio, so that generation of alternative projects might be ready in, say, a couple of years or 5 or 6 years when the next infusion of, say, trillions of dollars for infrastructure and built environment work is ready or sort of comes through. I think even, Joe Biden, who is not someone I would have imagined pitching himself as wanting an FDR-sized presidency a few years ago, has committed to that, at least rhetorically. And something like $2 trillion set aside for climate and infrastructure-focused investment were he to win. We can talk about whether that's like a realistic thing we think he will really do. But I think even he is committing that kind of rhetorical attention to that kind of an investment program that's tied to at least some principles of the Green New Deal. I think it's pretty important for us to begin preparing for the eventuality that money is available in a few years for some of these transformative community level infrastructure and public works projects. And the Super Studio is just one vehicle for beginning to generate some alternatives to the kinds of things that might otherwise be built.
So I can't resist asking, are you optimistic about the coming election?
God, I hate this question. I don't know. I feel like no particular way about it. I just can't. I don't even know how to feel. What about you?
It varies day by day. Well, I'm going to take that as an entree to broaden the conversation and the questions. This has been absolutely fantastic. And Nancy, you have been asking Billy fantastic questions and great exchange. I can't begin to do justice to all of the questions that have come in. There are a lot of them. I would characterize them kind of by saying that there are quite a few questions that I think really are just people really responding to the unknowns that both of you have also shared. We don't know the answers to how the Green New Deal really happens, really gets implemented, really overcomes the lack of trust in government. Really, should it really be top down or should it be incremental? Should it, can it happen at the speed at which we really need things to, to happen? Would it be more effective if designers really partnered with folks in the business school on a more sustainable version of capitalism and instead of quite, so there's quite a few questions just kind of around, and I don't expect you to be able to answer them, but I'm sure they've come up with you as well. So what do you guys think about all of these unknowns, and how do we then try to advance to get to actually get to implementation?
Well,
go for it, Nancy.
So I can just offer, I've been reading a lot of history lately, which I find comforting, because you learn that we've been here before in some version or another. And so the New Deal historian Eric Rauschway, who's at UC Davis, I think, was writing about the election of 1932 and the extraordinary events of Roosevelt's first term. And he writes, when FDR took the oath of office, every moving part of the machinery of the American economy had broken down. Banks, farms, factories, and trade had all failed. In other words, there was a profound sense of dire emergency. So, so we're here in this contradictory state where we're seeing now, that 2020 has been the year of seeing what happens when our public systems, which were built up over decades, have been disinvested and are failing. The systems of public health, public education, just all of so much of what we thought would get us through something like a pandemic, has been shown to be just a skeleton of what it once was. So I'm thinking that maybe this is the opportunity. And then when the New Deal happened, and it also had the advantage, Roosevelt didn't run on a New Deal. He ran on, we need to get past the Great Depression. There was just an enormous amount of legislation that happened, by today's standards, lightning speed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's all right. I think I don't know if I read so much history because I find it comforting, but it's just like sometimes a welcome and semi-learned distraction from like the rest of my life. And I've also been reading not about FDR's first election, but about his re-election against Wendell Willkie, former leader of Georgia Power, and Georgia Power being a really interesting sort of historical example, of really being the one of, if not the primary antagonist against the TVA, against the REA, against the New Deals, what Wendell Willkie would have called the sort of crowding out of private investment by, the introduction of public investment. A claim which, has been rebutted and refuted over and over and over again by a variety of folks, but most prominently Mariana Mazzucato, who's, sort of shown how literally every piece of private sector commercial technology really can trace its roots back to public investment, and we could go through that in a whole other conversation. But Willkie, winds up running for the presidency and putting essentially the New Deal on, as the sort of making that election into a referendum on the New Deal and losing pretty convincingly. After he spends most of the 1930s trying to use Georgia Power and its conglomerate sort of structure to offer a private version of what the New Deal offered. So the TVA, in addition to producing power, is also, really, really committed to producing what it thought were sort of utopian communities and community development. So building literal housing infrastructure and trying to sort of develop a kind of culture that, it's very strange to read about now, but I think was still really committed to things outside of the provision, say, of power alone, and doing it in places that Georgia Power and Wendell Willkie and others outright refused to do. And only after the TVA drove down rates in those places was it possible for the private sector to really be able to begin both building transmission lines and offering electrical appliances to people who weren't, exorbitantly wealthy at the time. And I've been thinking about that a lot because I think, that's where we can sort of see the sort of seeds of the sort of hollowing out of government beginning, the sort of neoliberalization or financialization of everything, sort of beginning to manifest themselves in the U.S. They obviously have longer roots than that, but for me, that's the part that's been foregrounded most recently, is in this operation of Georgia Power as a sort of private alternative to the TVA, and in large part trying to sort of replicate the kinds of services and infrastructure provision that the public sector often offers, and that we see sort of represented in many of the same ways that sort of industrial planning or corporate planning work now. And we see manifested in the way that both like the federal government and certainly state and local government have been systematically chipped away at and hollowed out, and created or designed to be unable to sort of provide the most basic services that they were sort of constructed to provide, as a way of making the argument against what the public sector can do, right? So in hollowing out a state government and making it incapable of providing basic services, it then becomes easier to argue that state government can't provide basic services and we can continue this program of privatization. And I've been thinking about that because I think one of the central or sort of unanswered questions for Green New Dealers, and one that I don't really know, what to do with, is around this sort of expediency versus, say, like democracy question. So how do we, whether we're building new stuff or repairing and retrofitting what we have, how do we do the most built environment and public works projects we've probably ever done, faster than we've probably ever done them, and hopefully better than we've ever done them, while living up to sort of small d democratic values? And how do we think about doing that in ways that restructure rather than reproduce the kinds of power relations we find in communities in the US now? And I say that again because I think like the partnership model of the New Deal, to go back to Siebel, enabled lots of things that were, I think, really exciting. Most notably, the sort of durability of the New Deal coalition to last well beyond FDR and the sort of supermajorities Democrats enjoyed at the time in Congress. But also because it relied on existing power structures, meant that in places where, Jim Crow was the sort of law of the land, that it was lengthened and strengthened and given more, say, support and able to express itself in the physical landscape more severely and longer than it would have otherwise. And I don't know what the answer is to how we balance that expedience or that speed question with the democratic or sort of small d democratic question, but it's one of the most important ones on the implementation side for designers to think about as well.
So obviously one of the answers to the unknowns is look back to history. So that also is a segue. I mean, are we teaching our design students this history? And I would say in general, not really. So there's also quite a lot of questions about how do we change academia? How do we change the education of designers? And there's very particular requests, Billy, could you please post your syllabus with the critical readings, and some students would definitely, some attendees would love to see that. But it's also, I think a really great question of just how we don't have very many studios with nonprofit clients. We actually do have, we certainly have some, generally more in urban design, but not in architecture, not so many in landscape. How do we really teach the next generation to treat the public as their client is a really big question, and just incorporating this in general, recommendations for how to incorporate a different the attitude of repair, not just brand new. How do we incorporate that into schools? Any quick thoughts?
So here,
I was just saying, Nancy has a great piece in Places today you should talk about. Yeah.
So here's a thought experiment. So because the past 40 years, ever since the election of Ronald Reagan, have been devoted to dismantling the New Deal and the various, and the Great Society, and all the efforts that came after that, and including, I might add, by Dwight Eisenhower, who maintained the programs of the New Deal and did a lot of building. Maybe you just almost have a project in which your client is Harold Ickes, the Secretary of the Interior, who ran the Public Works Administration and was giving out contracts for these enormous public works, or Harry Hopkins, who ran the WPA and was giving out contracts to create the San Antonio Riverwalk and the Griffith Observatory, and all the airports. So maybe it's trying to sort of work one's way sort of back, and what did it feel like to be in the, working for the federal government in the 1930s and having this tremendous amount of power and budget, and you were harnessing it to building. But here, the fact that it might be retrofitting, is not inconsistent with this, because you're still talking about somebody who's working for a federal government and who's thinking, what do we need for the public good, and how can the built environment serve that? And so, that would involve someone going back and really looking. I mean, and these were two extraordinary people who were brought into the New Deal, and they were both, just exemplars of a good government, incorruptible, because they knew that public works were so prone to graft. So there's just a thought experiment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
no, I think that's right. I mean, go ahead, Ellen.
Go ahead, Billy.
I was just going to say, there's a great piece in Places today of Nancy in conversation with Peggy Deemer that everyone should read. And one of the things, this question kind of gets asked to Peggy there, and there's some things I think that she and I agree with, and then some other things that aren't as present there that I just wanted to quickly mention. But one of those is just the decentering of studio within design education. And this varies from school to school, but at most schools, the studio is the centerpiece, and in some places like the only piece that really gets any attention. And to the extent that history and theory, and then other sort of either technical or theoretical skills are part of the curriculum, they're always at best secondary and at worst kind of like ancillary or tertiary to the way that design education tends to work. And this tends to produce a sort of system in which design students are conditioned by being overworked in studio and in the rest of their curriculum for a lifetime of exploited labor, in which they're detached from any critical engagement with their role in aestheticizing global capital. And it's not a surprise to be overworked at 80 hours a week in design school and then go work at a firm where you're overworked for 80 hours a week and underpaid and get meager benefits and all of the things that tend to really cut against the idea that people probably come into design school with of what their life will be like as practicing architects or landscape architects or urban designers. And so, thinking about, I just posted the syllabus for this year's studio into the chat. I'll post last year's as well. And I'm happy to send it to Ellen for folks who want to see it if they don't see it in the chat. But I think one of the ways we've tried to think about this is just thinking about academia as not really all that concerned or attending to markets, which may sound a little silly. But one of the things that design schools have tended to organize themselves around is on this attenuation of the worst outcomes of market forces now. So working on the fringes of markets, but still very much thinking about the world as shaped solely by private capital. And so what we've tried to do, I think, in some of these studios, in addition to this more critical engagement with reading and theory and political economy, is to think differently about the way that projects materialize and not view the role of a design studio as, say, producing the conceptual plan for a local chamber of commerce who's probably going to get a conceptual plan together anyway, but they're just getting it from us very cheaply. But to think about connecting our work to movement groups, again, who, again, have like very, very compelling and radical visions for the future, much more radical than most designers can like even imagine, and have yet to really translate that into a sort of visual culture or visual set of materials that can then be sort of placed alongside these competing visions for the future and become attractive to either public or private funders, to be taken from that sort of initial conceptual stage to the CD and implementation stage. And so again, I think like thinking about ways that the university to remain or to become once again relevant, if it was ever relevant, it has to think about ways that we can use the incredible power, resources, prestige, privilege that they afford to challenge the sort of hegemonic forces of private capitalism and markets and market fundamentalism that shape design practice. I don't expect sort of leading firms to sort of take this on first. They can't. Their work is structured entirely by those systems. But academia doesn't have to be. We've just chosen to be.
So I've always felt, not everyone agrees, not many agree with me, but that working on suburbia is the most radical project, because it really, there's just an assumption it's just there. And yet, so if the New Deal really did focus so much on rural areas where the poverty was so intense, since 2005, more Americans of poverty live in the suburbs. The suburbs are where so much the problems are. They are also contributing the lifestyles that worsen climate change the most, other than the flying, which is sort of everybody. And others have written about sort of the Green New Deal doesn't really focus so much on the issues of auto dependency. It doesn't focus enough on land use, on so many of the things that designers really are dealing with. Do you see opportunities in the suburbs?
Yeah, so Nancy, you jump in if you want to, but I'm happy to go first.
Take it away.
Yeah, so I mean, the way that we've approached this, or the way that I think about this, is really to respond just directly to the way the Green New Deal, the non-binding resolution was introduced. So at the press conference back in February 2019, where it's introduced and AOC and Markey and others are sort of at the podium, one of the first things she says is that people should view this document as a framework and an invitation to collaborate, or like in design language, as an RFP. And so we've viewed it as an incomplete and living document, something that included lots of interested parties from across a variety of different sectors of the economy, but that is a living thing that designers and planners can and should sort of do what they want with. And I've had plenty of colleagues who looked at it, and I think their first response was, yeah, it doesn't deal with land use, it doesn't deal with land development, doesn't deal with sort of urbanization generally, so it's not really for me. I'm not going to worry about it. And that's fine, but I think, for us anyway, it seems to me it's the only comprehensive and sort of compelling climate and design agenda on the table in the U.S., and it seems likely that's going to be the case for quite some time, and that it needs further fleshing out and further detailing and further ideation. And designers aren't necessarily going to lead much, if any, of that, but one thing they can contribute is on this question of land use and implementation. And I think for us anyway, that's something we hope will come out of the Super Studio, is a bunch of ideas that a couple people working, kind of remotely here or in Philly or wherever can't do on their own, that we need hundreds or more, designers at every design school in the country working on as much as we can.
Well, I would add to that and just say that, the New Deal, and again, Billy showed this slide, it really was what you could call an incremental revolution. It was highly flexible. It was extremely agile. Programs were started when they didn't do enough or they didn't succeed, or when the Supreme Court declared them unconstitutional, they were done away with. New ones were started. But also it's really interesting to think, the New Deal attracted so much talent. to the federal government. And a lot of it were people who were in Eleanor Roosevelt's circle, were people who were in the circles that they had formed when FDR was governor of New York. So I mentioned Harry Hopkins, who was enormously powerful, ran the WPA. He was a social worker. Harold Ickes came out of Chicago, the good government movement. Rex Tugwell was a young economist at Columbia, really interested in farms. Francis Perkins was a labor activist. So I think we're so used to thinking of the people who go to Washington really as lawyers and economists, not as designers, not as social workers, not as labor activists. And I think the challenge for the design disciplines, for anybody in it, is to do the kind of work that will get the attention of people in government who are looking for ideeds.
Yeah,
really well said.
That is actually where I think our design media comes in. And this is why we're so focused on public scholarship, on expanding, the audience for the good ideas that designers have.
Yeah, I think that's all. Oh, sorry, Ellen, can I just say one thing really quickly? I think that was so well put by Nancy. The only thing I would add is to sort of extend one of her points is that, I referenced the TVA and the REA and these massive airport sort of projects. But the bulk of the New Deal projects that Nancy sort of alluded to were like sanitary sewer infrastructure and, public schools and courthouses and post offices, and sort of rural conservation and afforestation projects. They weren't they weren't the kinds of things that wind up on the cover of like Architect magazine. And I think to Nancy's point, like that's a design media question and also like a design professional organization, AIA, ASLA, APA question about the kinds of work that they want to choose to elevate. And there's sort of a chicken and egg situation about who goes first there, but design schools can right now this decenter, and this is actually a really good year to decenter studio and think about other kinds of knowledge and expertise they want to build into their curriculum. And APA, AIA, ASLA, all of the other sort of professional orgs can think about, whether or not those kinds of lower profile public works projects that aren't going to, attract hundreds of millions of dollars through a HUD grant or whatever it might be to build in lower Manhattan or San Francisco or Chicago, but are going to appear in places like Helena, West Helena, or Wynn, or wherever it might be in the Southeast. Like those are the kinds of things that they can begin to find ways to elevate either through the rewards or feature rating or other kinds of work.
Well, that's also where, Nancy, you brought up earlier on that what gives you some optimism is actually that we've hit such a low point that actually now is the time for more radical change. But we really didn't even talk that much about all of the attention to racial inequality, to the racial justice, and the opportunities for really environmental justice that is such a key part of the new version of the New Deal, since that really is the dark history of the first time around. We don't have much time left, but so Billy, you mentioned public housing and certainly affordability, certainly the issues of repair and thinking about so many minority neighborhoods that are really need some fixing, some are in bad repair. Any other thoughts in particular about where can people go? What resources can really help design schools better address the kind of justice issues within the Green New Deal?
Yeah.
Go on, Billy. Yeah.
Sure. Well, so, I will say design schools are very bad at this because design schools are very bad on questions of justice. And I think expecting, our existing sort of faculty and to some extent students to figure all this out on our own is like a little silly. It's going to require, bringing other people into schools of design who probably don't have the same background or the same sort of portfolio or the same whatever it is that we use in our faculty sort of searches. And there are obvious like easy ways to do that through the sort of massive adjunct system that schools have, but we also have to commit, tenure track lines to people who are not probably the most obvious choice for a design school to bring in to teach studio or to teach other things. And there are a couple ways to think about that. And, I think there are lots of places where the kind of retrofitting suburbia like work and the Green New Deal actually like intersect in ways that would make those specific people really, really obvious and clear to schools that want to see them. And one is around this like infrastructure and road building question. So thinking about post New Deal, so the next sort of major infrastructure building period for us, semi-post-war suburbia, but also urban renewal and the construction of the urban freeway system that was predicated on, evicting essentially low-income communities of color and pouring urban freeways into where they once stood. California has been semi-successful at finding certain segments of the freeway system to deconstruct. And I think that's an interesting model in lots of ways for schools to think about focusing energy on. But the thing California didn't do particularly well was to think about what happens once that segment is gone. And so what happened is when that void is created in urban space, luxury real estate development fills it in. And so one of the things we had this report out with Data for Progress back in March or April on thinking about what a Green New Deal for the transportation system might be. And one of the many things we sort of called for in there, one of them was a targeted urban freeway removal system that took them out for lots of reasons. One being historically they've been used to destroy low-income communities of color, but also they continue to spew tons and tons and tons of particulate matter into, again, low-income communities of color in cities all across the US, large and small, and to then take the land that's left over from that process and turn it over to those communities in a form of cooperative ownership so that they can determine what happens next. If they decide they want to build public housing, public parks, market rate housing that they can own and profit from, I think that becomes one of the models. And that requires thinking about questions of ownership and economy that architects and landscape architects and city planners, to a less extent city planners, but certainly architects and landscape architects just are not equipped to do. And that's a long way around to saying, again, we can't expect existing schools that have not taken these questions on very seriously or very well to answer all of them now just because they've been foregrounded for them for the first time or for one of the first times. It's going to require it's going to require sharing the power and resources and other things that especially elite academic institutions have with communities who are often harmed by the work we produce. And there are lots of ways that could happen. But I think creating tenure track lines for scholars who are working on these topics in ways that aren't really conventional. They're not going to produce the sort of sexy portfolio that gets people the sort of architecture faculty job or landscape architecture faculty job, is one way to think about doing it.
So I would extend Billy's answer and say one thing that schools can do, which is a different kind of effort, but something that is extremely implementable, is what's called Decolonize the Curriculum. And I think that we have seen, just to make the books that architects and landscape architects read less Eurocentric would be a significant shift. And the next few weeks, we're going to actually publish an article which argues that Catherine Bauer's Modern Housing and a book published in 1945, Black Metropolis, should be on the syllabus. But if you actually then, just really scrutinize all the books that we have been reading for a very long time and look at the agendas that they promote. Look at the agenda of Delirious New York, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a great point. The design canon is like so overdue for a complete dismantling and reconstruction. I think, Nancy put it very well.
All right. I want to really thank both of you. It was awesome. We obviously could go on forever. I wish we were live because we would be going out and having drinks and just continuing this conversation. But we can't. Nancy's in San Francisco, Billy's in Philadelphia, I'm in Atlanta. My last comment is that regardless of what side of the political aisle anyone listening here is on, it's really important to go vote. And at Georgia Tech, we actually know that 78% of the students are registered, but that means there's still a good 22% that have not registered, and the deadline is October 5. Note that. And of those 78%, only 58% typically vote in major election years. So I'm just encouraging the students to really, if this has fired you up, pro or con, the best way to act on that is to vote. And with that, thank you, Nancy and Billy and the doggy.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.